It's June in the garden, and as you can see, the plants in my straw bale garden are growing beautifully. Today we're going to talk about if you want to grow in a straw bale garden, what crops you can grow vertically and how to do it, and also how to condition your straw bales in an organic method. This season is my third season using straw bale gardening, but before I began, I read a couple of books on straw bale gardening. One was from Craig LaHoulier and one was from Joel Karsten. Both books are very similar and are very good at the step-by-step how-tos. I chose the organic approach rather than the synthetic fertilizer, but before I could do any of that, I had to get my straw bales secured and put in place. I got my straw bales from a local farmers co-op, and when it came to actually putting them on the garden, the biggest question is, do you put it where the straw is running across or where the straw is going up and down? And you can actually do both. The thing is if you do it with the straw going up and down, you're going to get taller bales, and it's also going to be able to drain water a lot quicker because you've got the straw going up and down and it's going to go through very quickly. And because we can get really hot and dry in the summer, I really wanted to have a little bit of extra water retention, so I chose to do them crossways. And not only that, because they are a little bit lower to the ground, then I would be able to maximize the space that I could grow crops vertically and still be able to reach them. So that's why I decided to do the bales going across rather than up and down. The only thing I had to be mindful of was when planting, I needed to make sure that I didn't cut the string that held the straw bales together. Setting up this cattle panel trellis for the vertical system with the straw bales was actually very easy. It just took 2 people to be able to get it set up. The first thing I had to do was set up T-posts, and we probably set them up about 4 feet apart. I really don't think the distance matters that much as long as you have enough to keep the cattle panel secure. From there, we situated the cattle panel between the T-post and the straw bales. Of course, we had the cattle panel lifted up. That way we were able to make full use of all the vertical space. We didn't want the cattle panel to be directly behind the straw bale. We wanted it to be lifted up a little bit. And to secure the cattle panel, we used zip ties. The timing of putting up the cattle panel is very flexible. I went ahead and did it early on in the conditioning process, but you can do this anytime, even after planting, as long as you get it secured before your plants obviously need it to be able to climb. Overall, this process probably took maybe 15 minutes with 2 people, so it was really easy to just fit in during the conditioning process. The first vertical crop that most people think about when they're growing in straw bales is the tomato. For me, I love to use indeterminate tomatoes. These are ones that grow and continue growing. My favorite to grow on a straw bale method on this kind of trellis is a San Marzano, but I also love Amish paste or really any kind of beefsteak tomato that will grow. Tomatoes grow very well in straw bales in general, but using a trellis system like this enables them to be able to grow up, and then you can tie the tomato branches to the trellis itself. A second option here is any kind of vining plant like a cantaloupe. I love growing cantaloupe with my straw bale garden method. Number one, because it's a cucurbit. They love compost, which is pretty much what straw bale gardens end up becoming, is growing in the compost. And they also climb very well, and they meander and they find the sun, but they also don't overshadow all the other crops. I plant my cantaloupes in between my tomatoes, and they're actually pretty good companion plants in the straw bale. You can also plant cucumbers in the same way. While I haven't planted cucumbers in a straw bale garden yet, I do plan to try that soon. I think it will be a great crop to plant in a straw bale and also be able to climb the trellis. Another crop that you can plant in a straw bale up a trellis, you could actually go ahead and plant in the straw bale, but I have chosen to plant them behind my straw bales, and this is black-eyed peas. And even though black-eyed peas aren't necessarily a vertical crop, they do grow a little bit, and so if needed, they can latch onto the trellis here behind the straw bales. You could also do this with pole beans, or you could do it with peas. Any kind of climbing crop with this trellis would go well either right behind the straw bales or planted directly in the straw bales. After planting, really all I have to do as far as maintenance goes is, like I said, make sure that the straw bales get watered, and so I put a drip line on the bales. And then as the tomatoes grow up, I do tie them off to the trellis itself. With the cantaloupe, sometimes I have to train it slightly just to make sure it continues growing up the trellis. A lot of times it'll send out tendrils and it'll do it on its own, but sometimes I do have to guide it just slightly. And then that's pretty much all I have to do until harvest. If my tomatoes get any kind of disease on the lower leaves, sometimes I'll come in and I'll trim off the bottoms. Generally, I don't prune out my suckers with my tomatoes that are planted in the garden in some way, so I usually don't do that. But if the tomatoes get a little bit unruly, sometimes I'll come back and I'll prune as needed. But that's another thing, is that this method makes pruning really simple, and so no matter your preferred method of pruning, whatever you end up doing, it's very accessible in the straw bale garden. When the cantaloupe starts growing into baby cantaloupes, they will need a little bit of an extra support besides just the trellis. And so what I usually do is, once I start realizing that I've got a melon forming, is I'll take some kind of a sling, whether that's an old piece of pantyhose or some kind of maybe old netting for like an onion sack, something that will allow the melon to actually sit in a sling, and I'll tie that sling to my trellis, and then I will let the cantaloupe continue to grow in that sling. So that's the only other thing that I do with the cantaloupe when it's growing. After I situated the straw bales, then I had to start conditioning them. That's one mistake that I think beginning straw bale gardeners make, is they don't realize that they have to go through a conditioning process. It's not a matter of just putting your straw bales on your garden and planting. They have to go through a process where essentially the straw bale becomes its own compost, and that's what makes this so successful. When I was planting my garden, though, I had to make sure that that conditioning process was complete before the earliest time was that I could plant the crops that I wanted to grow. And because I knew I wanted to grow crops like tomatoes and cantaloupe and squash that need to be planted after my average last frost, then I wanted to plan accordingly so that I could make sure that the conditioning process was complete before planting. To do that, I calculated my average last frost date, and then I counted back from when I might want to plant those crops to when I needed to start the conditioning process. Now, it's totally okay if you don't plant right at the end of the conditioning process. In our case this year, we had a very cool spring, and I wasn't able to plant my crops until 2 to 3 weeks after I could have planted them in my straw bales. But that was okay, because basically what keeps happening after the conditioning process is complete, that just means that your straw bales are ready if needed to be planted in. But you still have this compost action going on, and letting them sit for a couple of more weeks was not a problem. In fact, I think it actually worked to my advantage. So let's talk about the conditioning process. Most people who do straw bale gardens, they use synthetic fertilizer. I really wanted to stay away from that, and so I chose to use an organic or naturally derived fertilizer. I used a couple of different options this year. One is organic, but one is natural but not certified organic. In half of my bales, I used blood meal, which is the recommended organic nitrogen source that we need for conditioning our bales. The problem with blood meal is that it can be very expensive, and so if you have a lot of straw bales like I do, that can start to add up. Another option, though not certified organic but naturally derived, is Milorganite. Milorganite is a nitrogen fertilizer that I have used for my onions and for my straw bale gardens in the past, and I had quite a bit of it left over from previous years, so I went ahead and used that. But if you're concerned that it isn't certified organic, or if you have any concerns about where it comes from, definitely do your research and decide on your own what you feel comfortable with. But I used it on probably about half of my bales until I ran out, and then I started using blood meal, and I'll probably continue using blood meal in the future. For the conditioning process with using blood meal or Milorganite, what I needed to do is put 3 cups of that nitrogen fertilizer per bale every other day, And both on the days that you add the fertilizer and on your off day, the bales need to be watered. Now sometimes the rain obviously helps with that, but if it doesn't rain that day, the bales need to be watered. Once we do that full application of the 3 cups of the nitrogen source, then we have an application of half that, so 1.5 cups per bale. And then we do the same watering process as well. We water everything in, and then on the off day, we water. After that, then we add an all-purpose fertilizer. My favorite is Garden Tone, and what that does is it adds the phosphorus and the potassium and maybe some of the micronutrients that wasn't present with the nitrogen, which the nitrogen is kind of what's going to speed up and get the composting system kick-started. So we end with the all-purpose fertilizer on the bales, and after that, there's just a couple of days that you wait, you still continue to water, and then after that process is complete, then you can plant in your straw bale. Again, I think it's perfectly okay to wait a little bit longer after that, especially with using organic nitrogen sources, just because sometimes it takes a little bit longer depending on your rainfall, depending on your temperature outside. So I like to give it a few days buffer before I plant. Like I said, this year I had a couple of weeks and it worked out well. But ultimately, that is how we condition our straw bale gardens organically, by using the natural nitrogen source fertilizer. And that process itself does take some time. It takes some babysitting. We need to make sure we're not going out of town, because it does take that, making sure that it gets watered and making sure that it gets the nitrogen source. And after that though, I mean, the straw bale system in general is very hands-off. There's very little weeding having to be done. I do put a drip line on my straw bales so I can make sure to have an extra water source, especially when it gets hot outside. But for straw bale gardens, most of the work is done in that early conditioning process, when not a lot of the garden is being planted anyway, so we have a little bit of extra time. In the busy part of the garden season, you really don't have to do much with straw bales. So that's pretty much what we do to condition the straw bales before planting. As I said before, I'm growing tomatoes, cantaloupe, squash, and on the other side I've got black-eyed peas. But the order of that planting was important. The first thing I planted was tomatoes, mainly because tomatoes can take a little bit of cooler weather compared to the other crops that I was going to grow in this. And by planting the tomatoes first, then I was able to give them a head start to be able to start climbing before I planted the cantaloupe and before I planted the squash. Now, the squash wasn't necessarily a vertical crop, but I wanted to see how the squash did in the straw bale this year. I'd never grown them in straw bales, and I have to tell you, I'm pretty impressed with that. And then later, I direct sowed the black-eyed peas on the other side. So that's kind of the order of the planting here. When it came to planting the transplants, I took my hori-hori knife and I cut a circle in the straw. I found that made it easier for me, because I don't know if it's because I use the naturally derived nitrogen or what, but I haven't found it to be super easy to transplant into, because the straw hasn't completely broken down. So I wanted to have an easy way of making a planting hole, and for me, using a hori-hori knife to cut that circle was really easy. After that, I put about a handful of compost in the bottom of the planting hole, just to give the roots of the transplant a little bit of soil contact before it got acclimated to the straw bale and being able to grow its roots further into the straw bale itself. And then of course I put some of the straw back, and then I watered it really well. For the most part, planting these transplants was a pretty easy process. It was just a matter of coming out here and transplanting them into the straw bales. Like I said, I started with the tomatoes, but then after that I added the cantaloupe, because I knew that the cantaloupe would also be there to climb after the tomatoes got a head start. If you want to learn more about how to set up a straw bale garden and grow in it for your garden, check out this podcast with the founder of the straw bale gardening method, Joel Karsten, or check out this YouTube video where I show the results of my very first straw bale garden and what I thought about this new method. Here, 3 years later, I have to say it's one of my favorite ways to grow, especially tomatoes, but I'm learning how to grow other crops as well. And I hope that you've gotten some ideas that you can use in your garden. For more gardening how-tos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.